Welcome to this webinar series on V3 Discovery. As a reminder, the core of Discovery is really translating what the student currently does into variables that will help support competitive integrated employment. And we've organized those variables into the 4 C's. So no matter what step you're on, no matter what kind of information you're gathering, we're really trying to frame those into what does this tell us about the individual's interests and preferences that we've titled choices. What information have we gathered about the student's skills or abilities that could be contributions to a potential employer? What might be the conditions for employment? So really reframing barriers or reframing those challenges into conditions for employment. And who does the student know? Who do they hang out with? Who does the family hang out with that could be potential social capital to be able to use to make those connections to employment? So you should be well on your way to gathering information through interviews and surveys, and we are now moving on to step 3, the observations. In your materials for step 3, there are 2 documentation forms. The IC observations, which we'll describe here in a minute, has its own tool or form, and the home visit and the neighborhood tour has its own form as well. So I encourage you to print or pull up those tools in your Google folder as we walk through this process. So first, the IC observations. These are intentional community integrated experiences. This comes from Nila Benito, the University of South Florida. That's a term they came up with, the IC observations, and she termed it often hanging out with intention. Very different than the traditional way that we have done observations in the past. Traditionally, at least in my experience, you'd sit in the corner of the room with your yellow pad, because it's not a real observation if it's not a yellow pad, right? But we sit in the corner of the room and we mark down everything that we see. In this way is very different because we're going to forego the note-taking for the most part, and we're going to actually be a part of the activity that is occurring. You're going to be there working alongside, hanging out alongside, and actively involved in whatever activity you're observing. Very different than what we've done in the past, also in terms of what we're focused on. In the past, my experience, we're often focused on the challenges or the skills the student doesn't have that we need to teach, that kind of thing. This is not a deficit-driven type observation. Challenges are important, but they're really not the intention of the observation. The intention of the observation is to really look at, in this observation, can I identify some things that would tell me the student is interested in that or has a preference for that kind of an activity or that topic of an activity that would translate to your choices. What skills are they demonstrating currently right now that could be translated into an employment opportunity? Those are those contributions. Certainly you want to look at what those challenges are, but not be the primary focus. We want to reframe those challenges into conditions for employment. And are there any connections? Are there any social capital during this observation that we can focus on? And so if you look at your checklist under step 3, it's page 2 of the actual checklist, you'll see that we've kind of laid out some examples of things you might want to focus on. Typical life activities and routines, both at school and at home or in the community. The student, you want to see the student at their best. Where do they perform their best? You're going to want to see them in those environments because that's what's going to stand out in terms of those interests and preferences and those skills. And so we've kind of laid out an example of 7 different areas you might want to observe. You can certainly do more. You can certainly change those around, but there's some ideas that will help you really get at the point of these observations, which is discovering things about the student that you didn't otherwise know that can help you in making that match and translating those variables to employment. So some things about the IC observations. First of all, limit your note taking so you don't miss important things. If you have a permission to do so, taking pictures and videos really helps assist you with recollection later when you actually are going to fill out a form. And take as little notes as is necessary at the moment in order so you don't forget. But you'll want to do the filling out the actual IC observation form as closely as possible to the end of your observation. That way everything's fresh in your mind. And then you'll want to clarify anything that may be inconsistent or things you weren't sure about with family or friends or whoever you were observing with. You'll want to do that. Other important kind of rules of thumb in terms of documenting what you see is being careful about opinions and judgments. It's really easy to say things like, he liked that. Well, we don't know if somebody likes or dislikes something. We know whether they're smiling while they're doing that or not, whether they're resistant to doing it or not, whether they tend to better engage with that or not. Those are things that are observable. It's best to keep to things that are observable and are the facts rather than your assumptions or judgments about those facts. And then this is that list of examples of places that you might want to observe, those typical routines, some favorite places and activities. But you also want to see in novel experiences that will help tell you in a new work environment, or if they're presented with a new task within that environment, what might be some challenges that we're going to have to reframe into conditions for employment. So one of the first things you might want to do with your team is just brainstorm where you're going to do your observations and when. And again, this is an opportunity to divide and conquer. So everyone should have, on the team, should have an opportunity to do an IC observation. So if you get some chart paper, go to the whiteboard and just lay out these categories. What are some typical routines? And again, you're looking for where is the student when they're at their best. That's what you want to see, because those are going to be some of those variables that are going to support a good match. You want to see the student in their favorite places and their favorite activities. You do also want to identify some novel locations and some novel activities. Again, this will help to lift out what might be some conditions for employment, as well as what might be some needed supports, especially if the individual is going into a new job setting. And so use this as an opportunity. If the school is going on an outing, jump on that for, hey, this is an opportunity for an IC observation and a novel activity. If the family is going to a new environment or going to participate in something with their church or whatever, this might be a great opportunity to gather some IC observation data. Here is the actual documentation form. If you printed that, you can look at that now, but these are the questions that after you conduct your IC observation, these are the questions that you're going to answer. What sparked the student's interest or motivation, and how could you tell during that observation? Again, what were those skills or abilities that the student demonstrated, and supports that were necessary? That's going to be huge when we look at actually preparing an employment setting. What supports do we need to have in place in order to ensure that the student can engage the most successfully? How did they interact with other individuals or unfamiliar people? Were there any supports that were used to help facilitate interaction? Were there any challenges the student experienced during the activity? And any additional supports that, if used, may have made the experience more successful for the student? And then finally, just based on your experience for that observation, is there something you would like to see explored further? Sometimes we actually create observation opportunities by taking a trip to the grocery store, or whatever that might be, in order to further investigate something that might have sparked your interest at a previous observation. So that's what this question really is related to. And the second part is doing the home visit and the neighborhood tour. If the family is open to you visiting the home, that's critical. That's probably one of the students' most favorite places, is to be at home. And so you get to see them in a place where they're often most successful, which allows you to really see the skills that they have, the abilities that they can bring and translate to a job setting. And the neighborhood tour is also important. So, because the number one barrier to employment is transportation. And so if, especially if the student isn't going to have a driver's license, although we strongly support that every student, no matter the perceived skill level, has the opportunity to take driver's training. And many, many students will get that driver's license and eliminate that barrier, but some may not. And so I think the closer that we can find employment to the home helps improve improve the chances that they're going to keep that job and be able to access that job long term. So the neighborhood tour really helps you look around at what's in the neighborhood, what are some potential employment opportunities. If you can't make it out to the home or the family's not open to that, this is another way to do that. This is a Google map. This is a Google Earth map. It happens to be of my house. But this is one way, and you can actually get into 3D images using Google Earth or Google Maps. So that's another way to kind of look around. At least it doesn't get you inside the home, of course, but it will allow you to look in the neighborhood to what employment opportunities might be in that area. Much like the interviews and surveys, this step of IC observations is going to take time. The more that you've brainstormed places to do these observations, the longer that time span is going to be. But we want you to camp here. This is where the bulk of the valid information about variables that can be used to support an employment match are going to be found, is in these observations. So between the interviews and surveys and the observations, you can be doing these interchangeably over the time needed before you really want to put that full discovery summary together, the vocational profile. So take your time here. The next step will be step 4, which is the V3 Discovery Summary, where we're going to take all of the data we've now collected and put it together in a framework to help support the match to employment.